Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In the Old West, a woman's value was often measured by the man whose name she carried, first her father's, then her husband's. But what happens when a woman decides her value is her own, that her life belongs to no man but herself? Tonight's story is about a young widow who was supposed to be a pawn, a prize to be claimed. But they soon learned that a cornered mare can kick harder than any stallion. So gather round for a tale of survival, defiance, and a woman's desperate journey for the one thing more precious than gold: freedom. A tale we call Clara's Stand. The day they buried her husband, Marcus, was the day Clara Burns' new prison was built. It was not a prison of stone and iron bars, but one of whispers, legal documents, and the suffocating weight of a town's expectations. As the last shovelful of dust was thrown onto Marcus's grave, a new and heavier earth began to settle on Clara's shoulders. Marcus had been a good man, a strong and respected rancher in the small, isolated valley of Harmony Creek. He had been a man of vision and ambition, and he had built a small but prosperous cattle ranch from nothing. He had also been a man 20 years her senior, a man she had been married to at 17 in a practical, loveless arrangement brokered by her impoverished father. She had respected him, even cared for him in a quiet, dutiful way, but she had never loved him. And in the secret, guilty corners of her heart, his sudden death from a rattlesnake bite had felt not just like a tragedy, but like a release. At 22, she was a widow, but she was also, for the first time in her life, her own woman. She was the sole heir to a fine ranch and a future she could finally write for herself. She was wrong. The chains were forged at the reading of the will. She sat in the stuffy office of the town's only lawyer, a man named Silas Croft, flanked by her late husband's family, his older brother Jed, a hard, brutish man with his brother's ambition but none of his decency, and Jed's sour, pinch-faced wife. The will was clear. Marcus had left everything to her: land, the cattle, the house. But then came the codicil, the fine print that Silas Croft, a man whose loyalty was to the powerful, not the just, read with a smug satisfaction. The codicil, influenced heavily by Jed and Marcus's final days, stated that as a young woman, inexperienced in the ways of the world, she was to be placed under the guardianship and protection of her brother-in-law until such time as she remarried. The ranch, her ranch, was to be managed by Jed. She was not an owner, she was a ward, a child to be looked after, her inheritance held in trust by the very man who had always resented her for marrying his successful brother. The invisible chains had been locked. She was a queen in name, but a prisoner in her own home. Jed and his family moved into the main ranch house, relegating Clara to a small guest room, treating her with a cloying, condescending pity that was more insulting than open hostility. Jed immediately took over the running of the ranch, his methods brutal and short-sighted, selling off-price stock for quick cash, his eyes filled with a greedy, triumphant light. But the final, most galling link in her chain was yet to be forged. The town of Harmony Creek, like many such isolated communities, was a place of rigid social laws. An unattached woman of property was a dangerous anomaly, a disruption to the natural order. It was the unspoken but universally accepted belief that she needed a new husband, and quickly. The man who saw this as his golden opportunity was the town's circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man of about 50, with a portly belly, a politician's smooth tongue, and cold, reptilian eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was the most powerful man in the valley, a man whose legal pronouncements were the final word on all matters. He had long coveted the Burn Ranch, its rich pastureland and its crucial water rights. With Marcus gone, and with a vulnerable young widow now in possession of it, he saw his chance. He began to call on her, under the guise of offering his legal counsel and his condolences. He would sit in her parlor, the one that was no longer truly hers, and speak of her difficult situation. He would praise her beauty, her grace, and lament the tragedy of a flower such as yourself, left to wither on the vine. Clara, though young, was not a fool. She saw the ambition and the lust behind his flowery, paternalistic words. She politely but firmly rebuffed his advances. Her rejection did not deter him. It enraged him. A man like Judge Thorne was not accustomed to being told no, especially by a woman. He abandoned the pretense of courtship and revealed the iron fist beneath his velvet glove. He made his final proposition to her one evening, with her brother-in-law Jed standing beside him, a silent, complicit partner in the transaction. "Clara, my dear," the judge said, his voice no longer smooth, but hard and cold. "Your situation is untenable. You are a woman alone. The town council, under my guidance, is prepared to officially declare you an infant guardian of your own property. Jedediah here," he gestured to her brother-in-law, "is prepared to sell the ranch to me to settle the debts your late husband left behind. You will be left with nothing. A penniless, disgraced widow." He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale cigars and power. "Or, you can make a sensible choice. You can agree to marry me. Your property will be secured. Your place in this community will be assured. You will be Mrs. Elias Thorne, a respected and protected woman. The choice is yours. A life of comfort or a life of ruin." It was not a proposal. It was an ultimatum. A threat. She was being sold, her life and her property a piece of chattel to be traded between two greedy, powerful men. She looked from the judge's cold, reptilian eyes to her brother-in-law's smug, triumphant face. She saw the full, horrifying scope of the prison they had built for her. Her husband's death had not been a release. It had simply been the transfer of ownership from one master to a new, more terrible one. In that moment, something inside Clara, a core of quiet, prairie-born resilience that she did not even know she possessed, finally snapped. She had been a dutiful daughter, a quiet wife, a grieving widow. She had played all the parts that the world had assigned to her, but she would not play this one. She looked at the judge and she gave him a slow, deliberate, and utterly defiant smile. "I would rather die in a ditch, Your Honor," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper, "than be the wife of a grave-robbing pig like you." The shock on their faces was a small, satisfying victory, but she knew she had just signed her own death warrant. They would not allow such an insult to go unpunished. They would ruin her, and they would do it quickly. That night, as a storm gathered over the mountains, Clara made her own choice. She would not be a ward. She would not be a wife. She would not be a victim. She waited until the house was dark and silent, until the snores of her brother-in-law echoed in the hallways. She packed a small bag with what little she had left that was truly her own. Then she pried up a loose floorboard in her room, a secret place Marcus had shown her. Beneath it lay his old, spare Colt Peacemaker, a gun he had kept hidden, just in case. She took the gun, its weight a heavy, and familiar, and yet deeply comforting thing in her hand. With the storm outside as her cover, she slipped from the house, the ghost leaving her own prison. She saddled her horse, a fiery little mare that was the only living thing on the ranch that was still truly hers. She did not know where she was going. She had no plan, no destination. She only knew that she was riding away from the invisible chains that had been forged for her, toward the vast, dangerous, and unknown freedom of the wilderness. She was no longer a wife, no longer a widow. She was a fugitive, and her journey for survival, and for a life of her own, had just begun. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving master, but its cruelty was honest. Unlike the smiling, backstabbing cruelty of men like Judge Thorne, the cruelty of the desert was a simple, straightforward proposition. You were either strong enough to survive, or you were not. For Clara Byrne, the flight from Harmony Creek was not an escape, it was a brutal, terrifying, and ultimately liberating education. She rode for 2 days, pushing her mare, Willow, to the brink of exhaustion, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the cage she had just fled. She rode into the Badlands, a jagged, broken country of deep canyons and crumbling mesas, a place where a person could disappear. The skills her late husband had taught her, the practical lessons of ranch life that she had once seen as a chore, now became the tools of her survival. She knew how to read the land for water, how to make a smokeless fire, how to navigate by the stars. She was not a helpless damsel, she was a rancher's wife, and she was tougher than she had ever known. But she was also being hunted. On the 3rd day, she saw them. 2 riders, far in the distance, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the blood red of the setting sun. They were not a sheriff's posse. They were trackers, hired guns, the kind of men who were paid to find people who did not want to be found. Judge Thorne had not wasted any time. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her first instinct was to ride, to flee, to push her already exhausted horse into a desperate, hopeless race. But then a new, harder instinct took over, the instinct that had been born in that final, defiant confrontation with the judge. She would not run. She would hide. She would fight. She led them into a labyrinth of narrow, winding canyons, a place where she had the advantage. She used her knowledge of the terrain to lay a series of false trails, to double back on her own tracks, to become a ghost in a landscape that was made for ghosts. For a full day, she played a desperate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, always staying one step ahead of her pursuers, her heart a constant, frantic drumbeat in her chest. She knew she could not keep it up forever. They were professionals. Sooner or later, they would corner her. She had to find an ally, a place of sanctuary. And in this lawless and forgiving land, she knew that sometimes the only place to hide from wolves is in the den of another, more dangerous predator. The whispers in the border towns, the stories she had overheard in her old life, all spoke of one man, a ghost who haunted these badlands. They called him Cole. Some said he was a deserter, others a train robber. All agreed on two things: he was the deadliest man in the territory, and he was an enemy of the very kind of railroad barons and corrupt officials who were now her pursuers. He was, she realized, a man who had once been an enemy of her husband, their ranches having clashed over water rights years ago. But he was also, she gambled, a man whose enemy's enemy might just be a friend. Finding him was a desperate, almost suicidal shot in the dark. She followed the faintest of rumors, a whisper from a prospector about a hidden spring in a place called Shadow Canyon. It was her last, best hope. She found the canyon at dusk on the fifth day, her horse near collapse, her own strength failing. The canyon was a narrow, hidden fissure in the rock, its entrance almost completely obscured by a thick growth of desert scrub. She rode in, her hand on the butt of her Colt, every nerve in her body screaming with a mixture of hope and terror. The canyon was a small, hidden oasis, a pocket of impossible green in a world of brown and red. A small, clear spring trickled from the rock face, feeding a grove of ancient cottonwood trees. And in the center of the grove, a small, smokeless campfire burned. A man sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle. He was a tall, lean figure, his face a mask of hard angles and old scars, his eyes a pale, chilling gray that seemed to miss nothing. He looked up as she rode in, and the rifle came to his shoulder with a smooth and hurried motion that was more terrifying than any sudden movement. "That's far enough," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They call you Cole," Clara said, her own voice trembling slightly, but she refused to let her fear show. "I need your help." A humorless, bitter smile touched the man's lips. "Last I heard, anyone with the name Byrne wanted me dead," he said, a clear reference to the old feud with her husband. "Times must be hard." "They are," she said simply. "I'm being hunted by men hired by Judge Thorne." The name got his attention. A flicker of something, the memory, a hatred crossed his face. "Thorne?" he said, the name a curse on his tongue. "What's your business with a snake like that?" Clara told him her story. She told him of her husband's death, of the will, of the judge's ultimatum. She did not plead for his help. She presented it as a business proposition, an alliance of convenience. "Thorne is your enemy as much as he is mine," she said. "He's backed by the same railroad men who are trying to squeeze you out. I don't have money, but I have information. I know the judge's plans, his partners, his weaknesses. And I know this land. Together, we can fight him. Alone, we will both be crushed." Cole was silent for a long time, his gray eyes studying her, weighing her, judging her. He saw not the soft wife of his old rival, but a woman with a core of tempered steel, a woman who had been forged into something new and dangerous in the crucible of her flight. He saw a survivor, and he respected that. "Thorne's got two of the best trackers in the territory on your trail," he said finally, not as a question, but as a statement. "The Logan brothers. They're a day behind me," Clara replied. "Maybe less." Cole nodded, a slow, calculating gesture. "All right," he said, lowering the rifle. "You can stay the night. We'll eat, and we'll see if the Logans are as good as they say they are." He gestured to the fire. "But you should know something, Mrs. Byrne. I don't take on partners, and I don't do favors. If I help you, it will be for reasons of my own, and the price might be higher than you're willing to pay." The alliance was forged, not on trust, but on a shared, mutual enemy and a cold, pragmatic understanding of survival. Clara had found her sanctuary, but it was the den of a wolf, a man whose motives were as mysterious and as dangerous as the land itself. She had escaped one prison, only to find herself in a new, more uncertain kind of cage, caught between the hunters behind her and the predator who sat across the fire from her. The uneasy truce in Shadow Canyon was a thing of tense, watchful silences. Cole was not a gracious host. He was a man accustomed to his solitude, and Clara's presence was an intrusion, a complication he clearly resented. He treated her not as a guest, but as a strategic asset to be assessed. He watched her every move, his pale gray eyes missing nothing, his silence a constant, unnerving judgment. Clara, for her part, refused to be intimidated. She was not a damsel in distress seeking his protection. She was a partner in a war she had declared. She pulled her own weight, tending to the horses, taking her turn at watch, her competence and her quiet, uncomplaining resilience slowly, almost imperceptibly, earning a sliver of his grudging respect. They did not have to wait long for their uneasy alliance to be tested. The Logan brothers were as good as their reputation. They arrived at the mouth of the canyon just after dawn on the second day, two grim, determined figures, their rifles held at the ready. Cole had been expecting them. He and Clara were positioned high in the rocks that overlooked the narrow canyon entrance, a perfect, natural ambush point. "There are two of them," Cole said, his voice a low whisper, his eyes never leaving the figures below. "I'll take the one on the left. You take the one on the right. Wait for my signal. And for God's sake, don't miss." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Her first real, life-or-death gunfight. The men below were not targets. They were killers, sent to drag her back to a fate worse than death. She rested the barrel of her husband's Colt on the rock, her hand surprisingly steady. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a new, cold resolve was forming. She would not be a victim. She would not be taken. The Logan brothers dismounted and began to make their way into the canyon on foot, their movements cautious, professional. They were walking into a trap. Cole gave a soft whistle, the sound of a canyon wren. It was the signal. Two guns roared as one, the sound deafening, echoing off the high canyon walls. One of the Logan brothers cried out and fell, a bullet from Cole's rifle taking him clean through the chest. Clara's shot, however, was not a kill. In that last, split second, a lifetime of ingrained decency had made her flinch. Her bullet struck the other brother in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering to the ground. The wounded man, screaming in a mixture of pain and rage, scrambled for the cover of a large boulder, his hand reaching for the pistol on his hip. "Damn it," Cole snarled, working the action on his rifle. But the man was already in cover. "Stay here," he commanded Clara, and then he was gone, a gray phantom moving with an impossible speed and silence through the rocks, circling around to get a better angle on their wounded, cornered prey. Clara was left alone, her heart pounding, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She had failed. She had hesitated, and now Cole was risking his life to clean up her mess. A wave of shame and a new, fierce determination washed over her. She would not be a liability. She could hear the wounded man groaning behind the boulder. She knew that Cole was trying to flank him, to get a clear shot, but the man was in a good position, well protected. Clara made a decision. It was a reckless, desperate, and incredibly brave move. She stood up from her protected position, in full view of the man behind the boulder. "Over here," she yelled, her voice a clear, defiant cry. The wounded Logan brother, hearing her voice, reacted on pure instinct. He peered around the edge of the boulder, raising his pistol, his attention now entirely focused on her, the primary target. It was the opening Cole had been waiting for. A single rifle shot cracked from the rocks on the man's flank. The Logan brother jerked, a look of ultimate surprise on his face, and then collapsed, his unfired pistol falling from his hand. The silence that followed was profound. Cole emerged from the rocks, his face a mask of cold, unreadable emotion. He walked over to where Clara stood, her body still trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a new, strange light. "That was either the bravest damn thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice a low growl, "or the most stupid." "Did it work?" she asked, her own voice shaky. It worked, he admitted. He looked down at the two dead men at the mouth of the canyon. You just started a war, Mrs. Byrne. Thorne won't take this lying down. He'll send more men. An army, this time. I know, she said, her resolve hardening. Then we'll have to be ready. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a shared enemy. They were partners, comrades in arms, their alliance now forged and sealed in the crucible of shared gunfire. She had proven she was not a liability. She had proven she had the steel to stand and fight. And he, in turn, had proven that he was a man who, for whatever his reasons, would stand with her. They buried the Logan brothers in shallow and marked graves, a grim and necessary task. As they worked, Clara knew that she was burying a part of herself as well. The soft, gentle woman who had flinched at the thought of taking a life was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the brutal, simple calculus of survival. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. The long, desperate journey for her own freedom was far from over, but for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone. The death of the Logan brothers sent a clear and brutal message to Judge Thorne. The helpless widow was not only a fugitive, but she was now a killer, and she had found a formidable, and equally deadly, ally. Thorne's response was swift and draconian. He abandoned all pretense of legal maneuvering. This was no longer a matter of contracts and coercion, it was a matter of open warfare. He placed a massive, official bounty on Clara's head, $5,000, dead or alive, for the murderous fugitive who had killed two of his deputies in the course of their lawful duties. The bounty poster, with a crude but recognizable sketch of Clara's face, was plastered in every town, saloon, and stagecoach station in the territory. She was now one of the most wanted women in the West. Thorne's strategy was diabolical. He had turned every greedy, desperate man with a gun into a potential enemy, a potential hunter. The Badlands were no longer just a place to hide, they were now a hunting ground, and she was the prize quarry. The news of the bounty reached Clara and Cole through their few, scattered contacts in the underworld. The weight of it was a crushing blow. He's turned the whole world against you, Cole said, his face a grim, stony mask. We can't stay here. We can't stay anywhere for long. There's no place in this territory a man won't go for that kind of money. The nature of their journey changed. They were no longer just hiding. They were actively on the run, a constant, nerve-shredding flight from a legion of unseen enemies. They moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, their days a blur of hard riding, and their nights a tense, watchful vigil. The bounty hunters came. They were a constant, ever-present threat. They would appear on a distant ridge, a glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel, or they would try to ambush them at a waterhole. Cole's skills, honed by a lifetime of being the hunted, were the only thing that kept them alive. He was a master of evasion, of laying false trails, of sensing a trap before it was sprung. But the constant pressure, the lack of sleep, the poor food, and the ever-present fear began to take its toll. They grew gaunt, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The quiet, watchful partnership they had forged in the canyon was now strained by the harsh realities of their desperate flight. It was during this time that the walls between them, the carefully constructed barriers of their own pasts, began to crumble. In the forced, desperate intimacy of their shared survival, they began to reveal the pieces of the people they had once been. Clara, in the quiet, exhausted hours of the night, would speak of her husband, of the quiet, decent life she had lost. She spoke not with the bitterness of a prisoner, but with the gentle sorrow of a woman who was mourning a past she could never reclaim. And Cole, in turn, began to reveal the ghosts of his own. He spoke in short, clipped sentences of a life lived on the wrong side of the law, of a betrayal that had cost him everything, of the reasons he had become a solitary ghost in the mountains. He did not ask for sympathy. He was simply, for the first time in years, bearing witness to his own history, speaking it aloud to the only person in the world who might understand. They were two broken, lonely people, adrift in a violent world, and in their shared vulnerability, they found a strange and unexpected comfort. A new, fragile, and unspoken emotion began to grow between them, a bond that was deeper than a simple alliance, a feeling that neither of them dared to put a name to. The breaking point came in a small, dusty, nameless town just north of the Mexican border. They had come for supplies, a risky but necessary venture. They had been in town for less than an hour when they were recognized. A sharp-eyed bounty hunter, a man with a reputation for being as relentless as a bloodhound, saw Clara as she was leaving the general store. The shootout in the street was a desperate, chaotic, and bloody affair. Cole and Clara were suddenly caught in a crossfire, as a half-dozen local gunslingers, their greed ignited by the massive bounty, joined the hunt. They were no longer partners in a strategic ambush. They were two cornered animals, fighting for their lives. They fought back to back, their pistols roaring, the world a blur of smoke, shouting, and the whine of ricocheting bullets. It was in this crucible of violence that Clara's transformation was finally, and irrevocably, completed. She was no longer a woman who was afraid. She was a warrior. She moved with a calm, deadly efficiency, her husband's Colt a natural extension of her own will. She saw a man draw a bead on Cole from a second-story window, and without a moment's hesitation, she raised her pistol and fired, her shot true. The man cried out and fell. She had taken a life to save a life, and she felt not a flicker of remorse. Only a cold, hard, and absolute certainty. They managed to fight their way to their horses, to break free from the town in a hail of gunfire. They rode hard, not stopping until they were miles away, until the town was just a distant, hazy memory. They made a cold camp that night, the adrenaline of the fight leaving them both shaken and exhausted. "You saved my life back there," Cole said, his voice a low, rough thing in the darkness. He was looking at her with a new, profound respect, and something more. "You saved mine," she replied, her own voice quiet. He reached out and gently touched a long, shallow cut on her cheek, a souvenir from a piece of flying glass during the gunfight. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. "The price of freedom," he whispered, "is higher than I thought. But it's a price we're paying together," she said. In that moment, and the quiet, shared intimacy of their camp, with the ghosts of the men they had just killed still hanging in the air around them, the last of the barriers between them fell. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a deep, profound, and desperate connection, a kiss that tasted of gunpowder, dust, and the shared, terrible knowledge of what it takes to survive in a world that is trying to kill you. They were no longer a widow and an outlaw. They were two survivors, two warriors, two lonely souls who had, in the heart of a bloody battle, finally found in each other a reason to keep fighting. The shootout in the border town was a turning point. It had been a victory, of a sort, but it had been a costly one. They had escaped with their lives, but the entire territory was now inflamed. The story of the outlaw widow and her mysterious, deadly partner had become a legend, and the bounty on her head, now doubled by a frustrated and enraged Judge Thorne, was a lure that no ambitious gunman could resist. They were no longer just being hunted. They were the center of a storm, a vortex of violence that was drawing in every killer, bounty hunter, and desperate man from 100 miles in every direction. They knew they could not keep running forever. Sooner or later, their luck would run out. It was Cole who made the decision. He was a man who had spent his life running, and he was tired of it. "We can't outrun the whole damn world," he said to Clara one evening, as they shared a meager meal of jerky and hardtack. "There's only one way to end this. We have to stop running from the storm. We have to become the storm." His plan was one of audacious, almost suicidal finality. They would stop being the prey. They would become the predators. They would stop reacting to Thorne's moves and would instead launch a direct, crippling attack on the source of his power. They would go back to Harmony Creek. "It's madness," Clara said, her heart a cold knot of fear. "They'll be waiting for us. The whole town will be an armed camp." "Exactly," Cole replied, a grim, determined light in his gray eyes. "They'll be waiting for us to sneak in, to hide in the hills. They won't be expecting a direct, frontal assault. We will use their own certainty against them." His target was not the town itself. It was the judge's new, opulent, and heavily fortified mansion, a monstrous house he had built on a hill overlooking the valley, a symbol of his absolute, arrogant control. And their timing would be the key. The judge, they had learned, was hosting a large, celebratory gala in 1 week's time. He was bringing in politicians and wealthy investors from the territorial capital to finalize the sale of the valley's land to the railroad. It was to be his ultimate triumph, the coronation of his new empire. And it would be the stage for his downfall. The journey back to Harmony Creek was a tense, nerve-shredding affair. They were moving into the heart of the spider's web, and they had to use every ounce of their skill and cunning to avoid the patrols and bounty hunters that now swarmed the region. But they were a different team now. The desperate flight had honed them, the shared battle had forged them into a seamless, efficient unit. The unspoken love that had been born between them was now a source of silent, unshakable strength. They moved with a shared mind, a shared purpose. They arrived in the hills overlooking the valley 2 days before the gala. The valley was transformed. It was an armed camp, just as Clara had feared. Judge Thorne's hired guns were everywhere, their presence a constant, oppressive weight on the town. The mansion on the hill was a blaze of lights, a fortress prepared for a party, but also for a war. Cole and Clara spent 48 hours in a cold, patient, and meticulous reconnaissance. They were no longer just two fugitives. They were two generals, planning their final, decisive battle. Cole, using his skills of stealth, slipped into the town at night. He made contact with the few, brave souls who had remained loyal to the memory of Clara's husband, Blacksmith, the doctor. He did not ask them to fight. He asked only for information, and for a few, crucial acts of quiet sabotage. Clara, using her knowledge of the land, scouted the perimeter of the mansion, identifying the weaknesses in its defenses, the blind spots in its patrol routes. Their plan was a two-pronged attack, a masterpiece of misdirection and brute force. On the night of the party, as the judge and his powerful guests were distracted by champagne and self-congratulation, the blacksmith would create a diversion, a fire at the far end of town, at the lumber mill. It would draw the bulk of Thorne's forces away from the mansion. And in that window of opportunity, Cole and Clara would launch their own direct assault. Their goal was not to kill everyone. It was singular. To get to the judge himself, to confront him in the heart of his fortress, to bring him down and, in doing so, to decapitate his entire operation. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail, and only one slim chance of success. As they lay on a dark, windy ridge on the night of the party, looking down at the blaze of lights from the mansion, a city on a hill built on a foundation of lies and blood, Clara felt a strange, profound calm settle over her. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. All that was left was a cold, pure, and absolute certainty. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper in the darkness, "I'm glad I'm here with you." Cole looked at her, at the woman who had walked through hell and had emerged as a queen of the ashes. He took her hand, his calloused, scarred fingers lacing with hers. "There's no one else I'd rather ride into hell with," he replied. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, deep kiss that was not a farewell, but a vow, a promise that they would face this final battle, and whatever came after, together. The cornered wolves were done running. They were about to turn and tear the throat out of the hunter. The judge's gala was a spectacle of obscene, arrogant opulence. The mansion blazed with the light of 100 candles and a dozen crystal chandeliers, the sounds of a string quartet and the high, brittle laughter of wealthy, powerful men drifting out into the cool night air. Inside, Judge Thorne, resplendent in a silk vest and a cloud of cigar smoke, was holding court, the very picture of a civilized man celebrating his ultimate triumph. He was so insulated by his wealth and his private army that the idea of a threat, of a reckoning, was a laughable impossibility. Outside, in the darkness, the storm was gathering. At precisely 10 o'clock, the first phase of the plan began. A bright, hungry, orange glow appeared at the far end of the valley. The blacksmith, true to his word, had set a controlled but massive fire at the lumber mill. The blaze, fed by stacks of dry, seasoned timber, roared into the night sky, a spectacular and terrifying diversion. The effect on the mansion was immediate. Shouts of alarm went up. The party ground to a halt as guests rushed to the windows. A half-dozen of the judge's lieutenants, men who served as his personal bodyguard, exchanged worried glances. "It's just the lumber mill," Thorne announced, his voice a booming, reassuring baritone, though a flicker of annoyance was visible in his cold eyes. He was furious that his perfect evening was being disrupted. Probably a stray spark. "I'll send some men to handle it." He gestured to his head of security, a hulking, scar-faced man named Marcus. "Take a dozen men. Ride down there and make sure it doesn't spread to the town." It was the exact reaction Cole had predicted. The bulk of the mansion's defensive force, a dozen of Thorne's best hired guns, mounted up and rode out at a gallop, a river of armed men flowing away from the true target, chasing a phantom. The mansion was now at its most vulnerable. Cole and Clara, who had been waiting in the shadows of a nearby ridgeline, began their approach. They moved with a silent, deadly grace, to ghosts melting into the manicured gardens that surrounded the house. They were not aiming for the front door. Their target was the rear of the mansion, the large, glass-paned windows of the ballroom where the party was still in a state of confused, agitated disarray. They reached the edge of the wide, stone veranda. The sounds of the music and the nervous chatter from within were a surreal counterpoint to the deadly seriousness of their purpose. They could see the judge, surrounded by his remaining guards, trying to calm his wealthy, important guests. "Ready?" Cole whispered, a pistol in each hand. "Ready," Clara replied, her own hands holding the familiar, comforting weight of her husband's Colt and a second pistol Cole had given her. Her heart was a steady, cold drumbeat. The fear was gone, replaced by an icy, absolute focus. They rose from the shadows as one. The grand windows of the ballroom exploded inward in a shower of shattered glass and splintering wood as they kicked their way through. They landed in the ballroom in a crouch, too dark, avenging angels appearing in the heart of the enemy's celebration. For a split second, the entire room was frozen in a state of shocked, disbelieving silence. The music stopped. A woman screamed. And then the world erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire. Cole and Clara did not wait for the enemy to react. They opened fire, their four pistols roaring, rolling thunder in the enclosed space. They were not firing wildly. Their shots were targeted, tactical. They took out the chandeliers first, plunging the room into a chaotic, flickering semi-darkness, the only light now coming from the scattered candelabras and the distant, ominous glow of the burning lumber mill. The party guests screamed and scrambled for cover, a panicked herd of terrified sheep. Thorne's remaining guards, a half-dozen of them, reacted with a professional, if surprised, efficiency, drawing their weapons and returning fire, using the overturned tables and the thick marble columns as cover. The ballroom became a battlefield. Cole and Clara, using the skills they had honed over months on the run, were a seamless, deadly team. They separated, moving along opposite walls of the room, creating a devastating crossfire. Cole was a ghost, a shadow flitting between the columns, his shots precise, economical, and deadly. He was a professional, a man who saw the gunfight as a complex, geometric problem to be solved. Clara was a fury. She fought with a raw, righteous rage, her face a mask of cold, beautiful determination. She was no longer a victim. She was the wrath of every person Thorne and his kind had ever crushed. Her gun seemed to be an extension of her own will, and she moved with a grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The fight was short, brutal, and one-sided. Thorne's guards, accustomed to bullying unarmed farmers, were no match for two desperate, battle-hardened warriors who had nothing left to lose. One by one, they were cut down. Judge Thorne, in a final, desperate act of self-preservation, grabbed one of the female party guests, a screaming, terrified woman in a silk dress, and used her as a human shield, dragging her toward a side door. Cole saw it, but he couldn't get a clear shot. But Clara could. She did not hesitate. She took a deep breath, raised her pistol in a steady, two-handed grip, and fired. It was an impossible shot, in the flickering, chaotic light, with a moving target. But her aim was true. The bullet struck Thorne high in the shoulder, the one part of him that was exposed. He screamed in pain and rage, his grip on the woman faltering. The woman broke free and scrambled away. The judge was now alone, wounded, and cornered. He stared across the ruined, smoke-filled ballroom at the woman who had shot him, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and a dawning, terrible understanding. He had not just been defeated. He had been undone, his empire of fear and power brought crashing down by the very woman he had dismissed as a weak, insignificant pawn. He raised his own small, fancy pistol, a final, futile gesture of defiance. Before he could fire, two shots rang out, almost as one. One from Cole's gun, one from Clara's. Judge Elias Thorne was thrown back against the wall, his silk vest suddenly blossoming with two dark, crimson flowers. He slid to the floor and lay still, his cold, reptilian eyes staring sightlessly at the ruined splendor of the party that had been meant to be his coronation. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whimpering of the terrified guests and the distant, crackling roar of the fire at the lumber mill. Cole and Clara stood in the center of the ruined ballroom, two solitary figures in a sea of smoke and shattered glass. The battle was won. The tyrant was dead. But they both knew that the war for their own souls was far from over. The aftermath of the Mansion Massacre, as it came to be known, was a strange and unsettling piece. The powerful, wealthy guests, the politicians and investors, were a collection of terrified, babbling witnesses, their appetite for exploiting the valley having been permanently soured by the night's brutal events. The remaining hired guns, their leader dead, and their paymaster's blood still wet on the ballroom floor, simply melted away into the night, their loyalty evaporating with their last paycheck. The town of Harmony Creek, and the valley it governed, was, for the first time in a very long time, truly free. But freedom, Clara and Cole discovered, was a heavy and complicated thing. They were not hailed as heroes. They were seen as ghosts, as terrifying, violent specters who had brought a necessary, but deeply unsettling, form of justice. When they walked down from the mansion the next morning, their faces smudged with gunpowder, their eyes holding the dead, weary look of soldiers after a long and brutal campaign, the townspeople did not cheer. They simply stared, their faces a mixture of gratitude, awe, and a deep, primal fear. Cole and Clara had been their saviors, but they were also a reminder of the terrible violence that lay just beneath the thin veneer of their civilized world. They did not stay. They knew that their presence, the memory of what they had done, would forever be a shadow on the town's new beginning. They took what they needed from the judge's stores to fresh horses, supplies, and a small, heavy bag of coins from his safe, a final, just payment for the life that had been stolen from Clara. And then, without a word of farewell, they rode out. They were free. Free from their pursuers, free from the past. But they were also adrift. The singular, all-consuming purpose that had driven them for months was gone, and in its place was a vast and certain emptiness. They were the people who had been defined by their fight, and now that the fight was over, they did not know who they were. They rode for weeks, with no destination, their journey a long, silent, and unspoken decompression. The bond that had been forged between them in the heat of battle now had to be renegotiated in the quiet, mundane reality of their shared freedom. The scars of their journey were not just physical. Clara was no longer the grieving widow or the cold-eyed avenger. She was a woman in a state of profound and unsettling transition. She had discovered a capacity for violence and a core of ruthless strength within herself that she was now forced to reconcile with the gentle, decent woman she had once been. Cole, for his part, was a man who had been given a second chance he had never expected. He had been a solitary ghost, a man who had turned his back on the world. But in his alliance with Clara, in the shared purpose of their fight, he had been forced to reconnect, to care, to feel. And he found that the feelings of loyalty, of protectiveness, of a deep and profound love for the woman who had fought beside him, were both a terrifying vulnerability and a source of a new, unfamiliar hope. They were two deeply scarred people, trying to find their way back not to who they had been, but to who they could now become. Their path was not an easy one. They were haunted. They would wake from nightmares, the echoes of the ballroom gunfight still ringing in their ears. But they had each other. They would sit by a campfire, under the vast, starry sky, and they would talk. They would share the stories of their pasts, the pains and the losses that had shaped them, and in that shared, vulnerable space, they began to heal. They were not just a man and a woman who had fallen in love. They were two soldiers who had survived a war, and they were the only two people in the world who could truly understand the landscape of each other's scars. Their love was not a soft, easy thing. It was a hard one, resilient, and deeply profound bond, a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal and unforgiving of worlds, hope, like a stubborn desert flower, could find a way to bloom. The fight for freedom had cost them their innocence, their past, and a piece of their own souls. But it had given them the one thing that had been missing from both of their lives, a future, and someone to share it with. The journey without a destination eventually led them north, to the high green and sparsely populated valleys of the Montana Territory. It was a land that felt like a different world, a place of towering pines, clear, cold rivers, and a deep, cathedral-like silence that was a balm to their weary souls. It was here in a small, secluded valley that was not unlike the one they had just liberated, that they decided to stop running. They used the money they had taken from Judge Thorne's safe to buy a small, unclaimed piece of land, 100 acres of meadow and timber with a rundown, abandoned trapper's cabin. It was a place that was rough and wild, a place that needed to be tamed and nurtured. It was the perfect project for two people who were trying to do the same for their own broken spirits. The work was hard, physical, and blessedly simple. They fell back into the familiar rhythms of a life they had both known before the storm. Cole, the outlaw who had lived a life of taking, rediscovered the deep, profound satisfaction of building. His hands, which had grown so accustomed to the cold steel of a pistol, now relearned the feel of an axe handle, the heft of a hammer. He repaired the cabin, built fences, and cleared the land with a quiet, focused intensity. He was not just building a home, he was rebuilding a piece of his own lost soul. Clara, the woman who had been forced to become a warrior, found a deep and healing peace in the simple, life-affirming tasks of a homesteader. She planted a garden, her hands in the rich, dark earth a form of prayer. She learned the names of the local herbs and wildflowers. The woman who had been a master of battle plans now became a master of canning and preserving, storing up not ammunition, but sustenance for the long winter ahead. They were not just building a ranch, they were building a sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of the past, while not entirely banished, were kept at a safe and manageable distance by the simple, grounding realities of their new life. Their relationship, which had been forged in the crucible of a shared, violent purpose, now had to be reforged in the quiet, daily intimacy of a shared life. It was a more difficult and more delicate task than any gunfight. They were two deeply private, wounded people, and learning to trust, to be vulnerable, was a slow and often painful process. But they learned. They learned to read each other's silences. They learned to recognize the signs of a coming nightmare and how to offer a quiet, steadying comfort in the darkness. They learned that the truest form of love was not in grand declarations, but in the simple and spoken act of standing as a steadfast guardian of the other's scars. They never spoke of the future in grand terms. Their future was built one day at a time, one mended fence, one planted row, one quiet, shared sunset at a time. They were not just a man and a woman, they were partners, in the truest and most profound sense of the word. A year after they had settled, a traveling preacher passed through their valley. He was a kind, elderly man with gentle eyes. He stayed with them for a night, sharing their simple meal. He did not ask about their past, but he was a man who had spent a lifetime reading the stories in people's faces, and he saw in them a deep, hard-won peace. The next morning, before he left, he offered to marry them. Clara and Cole looked at each other. They had never discussed it. They had no need for a piece of paper or a public declaration to legitimize the bond that existed between them. But as they looked at each other, in the clean, clear light of a new day, they both recognized that this was not about the law or about society. It was a ritual, a quiet, personal acknowledgement of the new life they had built together. They were married on their own porch, with the towering pines as their cathedral, and the whispering wind as their only witness. The preacher's words were simple, but they carried the weight of a long and difficult journey. As they spoke their vows, they were not just making a promise to each other. They were making a promise to themselves. A promise to leave the ghosts of the past behind, to embrace the quiet, simple beauty of the present, and to face the known future, not as two separate, broken survivors, but as one, healed and whole. The final chapter of the story of Clara Byrne and the outlaw named Cole is not a chapter of legend, but of a quiet, and remarked, and profoundly ordinary piece. They did not become famous. Their story, the true, bloody story of the fall of Judge Thorne and the liberation of Harmony Creek, was a secret they carried with them to their graves. The official version, the one that made its way into the territorial newspapers, was a sanitized tale of a local uprising, a brave citizenry throwing off the yoke of a corrupt tyrant. The two avenging ghosts at the heart of the story were a footnote, a mystery that was never solved. And that was exactly as they wanted it. They lived out the rest of their lives in their secluded Montana valley. They had children, a son with his father's quiet strength and his mother's resilient spirit, and a daughter with a fiery, independent streak that was a perfect fusion of them both. They raised their children in a world of peace, of hard work, and of a deep, abiding love. They were taught to be strong, to be self-reliant, and to have a fierce, unwavering compassion for the vulnerable. Cole never entirely lost the watchfulness in his eyes, the habit of sitting with his back to a wall. But the coldness was gone, replaced by a quiet, gentle wisdom. He became a respected, if somewhat enigmatic, figure in the small community that grew up around them, a man known for his uncanny ability to calm a frightened horse or track a lost calf, and for the deep, abiding silence that seemed to contain a lifetime of unspoken stories. Clara became the heart of that new community. The woman who had once been a prisoner of a town's expectations now became the architect of a new kind of town, one built on the principles of mutual respect and cooperation. The warrior queen became a matriarch, her home a place of warmth and counsel, her hands, which had once been so skilled with a pistol, now known for their ability to bake a perfect loaf of bread or to soothe a fevered child. They grew old together, their love a quiet, steady, and unshakable thing, a testament to the fact that even the most deeply wounded of souls can find a way to heal. Their life was not a grand adventure. It was a collection of small, simple, and beautiful moments: the first snowfall of winter, the birth of a calf in the spring, the laughter of their grandchildren on a summer afternoon. The open ending of their story is in its very quietness. The woman who had embarked on a desperate journey for the right to determine her own life had not just won her freedom. She had used that freedom to build a world of her own making, a world of peace, family, and a deep, abiding love. And the outlaw, the lonely, haunted man who had believed himself to be beyond redemption, had found his salvation not in a final, bloody gunfight, but in the quiet, daily, and profoundly courageous act of building a home. When they were old and gray, they would sometimes sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, not saying a word, their hands clasped together. They had walked through the darkest of valleys, had faced down the cruelest of monsters, and they had survived. They had survived not just the bullets and the knives, but the even more dangerous wounds of grief and betrayal. And in their survival, they had found something more precious than any treasure, more powerful than any act of vengeance. They had found a home, and they had found each other. And in the end, that was the only victory that had ever truly mattered.